Hello everyone, and welcome to our presentation on General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR. This presentation was prepared by Alexandra Hiddle, Vicki Elwood, and Edward Schmitz. Before we get started, let's go over what we hope to cover in this presentation. First, we will define GDPR, personal data, and the principles for processing personal data. Then we'll discuss GDPR and its impact, who it impacts, the data it applies to, and how it applies specifically to IT. We will review some of the early results of GDPR and also make recommendations to management. In conclusion, we'll summarize some takeaways that we hope you can obtain from this presentation. So what is GDPR? GDPR, or General Data Protection Regulation, has overhauled how businesses process and handle data. The EU's GDPR website says the legislation is designed to harmonize data privacy laws across Europe, as well as give greater protection and rights to individuals. The GDPR is Europe's new framework for data protection laws. It came into force in May of 2018 and replaces the previous 1995 Data Protection Directive. Previous UK law was based upon this directive. Standardization of data protection and compliance controls set a level of expectation for consent and protection across the European Union. These stronger rules on data protection mean people have more control over their personal data, and businesses benefit from a level playing field. Within the GDPR, there are large changes for the public, as well as businesses and bodies that handle personal information. We will explain this in more detail later. Before we go on any further, we should define personal data. The GDPR defines personal data as any information relating to an identified or identifiable natural person, the data subject. An identifiable natural person is one who can be identified directly or indirectly, in particular by reference to a name, an identification number, location data or online identifier, or to one or more factors specific to the physical, physiological, genetic, mental, economic, cultural, or social identity of that natural person. Common examples of personal data include a person's name, tax or national identification number, contact information such as a phone number or email address, username or system ID, employee identification number, or photographs, videos, and images. Now that we've defined personal data, let's discuss the 7 principles for processing personal data in accordance with GDPR. Number 1 is lawfulness, fairness, and transparency, which speaks to the subject of data collection. The next is purpose limitations, which says there should be a strong link to the original purpose for which the data was collected. 3, data minimization, which means to collect only the data needed to satisfy the purpose. 4, accuracy. The original data owner has a right to access, correct, and request the removal of the data. 5, storage limitation. Data is kept for only as long as needed to fulfill its purpose, or as long as needed as required by any laws or regulations. 6, integrity and confidentiality, which means that the data must be used as it is stated in the purpose, registered and notify all changes of use, limit and restricting of sharing any data. 7, accountability and compliance. The burden of proof shifts to the company to demonstrate compliance within the decision-making process and in the execution of the processes. Let's now dive into each of these principles one at a time. First, lawfulness, fairness, and transparency. Personal data must be processed lawfully, fairly, and transparently with regards to the data subject. To do this lawfully, the processing must meet the criteria as laid out in the GDPR. To achieve this fairly, the processed data must correlate with how it has been described. By informing the data subject of what, how, and why their data will be processed, ensures that you are transparent with regards to the processing of their data. So what rights do EU employees have? They have the right to be informed, the right of access, the right to rectification, the right to erasure, the right to restrict processing, the right to data portability, the right to object, and rights in relation to automated decision-making and profiling. Second, purpose limitations. Purpose limitations establishes the approved use of personal data. Data can only be collected for specified, explicit, and legitimate purposes. This data can only be used for those described purposes and no other without further consent. The GDPR also acknowledges that technology has created means through which a person may be known by certain online identifiers, such as information provided by devices, application, tools, protocols, cookie identifiers, and radio frequency identification tags. Third is data minimization. Only collect the personal data that is necessary for the purpose of the business function. Basically, if you don't need it, don't collect it. Personal data shall be adequate, relevant, and limited to what is necessary in relation to the purposes for which they are processed, which is Article 5 of the GDPR. The fourth principle is accuracy. Personal data must be kept accurate and current. All necessary steps must be taken to achieve this. No inaccurate data should be kept, and any errors in data should be rectified as soon as they become known. Next, integrity and confidentiality. Companies must not retain data if the data is no longer required for the purposes defined and agreed upon when processing. Businesses must then securely remove the data when it is no longer necessary. Any data that is kept without reason becomes a liability to the company. Record and data retention policies are needed to identify how long a piece of data will be held. Further storage is usually only admissible to the extent that it is necessary to fulfill a legal obligation or necessary for the establishment, exercise, or defense of legal claims. The final principle is accountability and compliance. Not only do you need to be able to ensure compliance with the previous principles, but businesses must be able to demonstrate the compliance as well. It is probably the most important of the principles, as data controllers need to take responsibility for the compliance, as well as be able to demonstrate that compliance. We've discussed the principles of GDPR. Now let's talk about its impact. So who does the GDPR impact? The GDPR not only applies to organizations located within the EU, but also applies to organizations located outside of the EU if they offer goods or services to or monitor the behavior of European Union data subjects. It applies to all companies processing and holding the personal data of data subjects residing in the European Union, regardless of the company's location. What data does it apply to? The material scope defines that it applies to data such as personal data, which we've already defined for you but should not be confused with other data classifications such as sensitive data, confidential information, or restricted information. It also applies to processing, which is generated by automated means or other than by automated means. So why does all of this matter, and how does it apply to IT? Data collection, handling, protection, and storage are fundamentals to the General Data Protection Regulations. As data moves through systems, we must be conscious of the context and purpose of the data, as well as our intent to process the data. IT will need to be mindful and educated on the rules and regulations of personal data in accordance with the GDPR. Policies and procedures drive compliance efforts to ensure we are operating in accordance with collection, classification, and retention of data in systems and processes. IT will also need to ensure that systems are integrated with each other and do not impede efforts to control data in respect to the GDPR. The EU's General Data Protection Regulation went into effect on May 25, 2018. Early numbers for the GDPR make clear that the policy has been a success as a breach of notification law. Stephen Eckersley, the head of enforcement of the UK Information Commissioner's Office, said the UK has seen a massive increase in reports of data breaches since the GDPR's implementation. In June 2018, Companies self-reported 1,700 data breaches and accurately estimated that the total will be around 36,000 breaches reported in 2019, which is a significant increase from the previous annual reporting rate of between 18,000 and 20,000 breaches annually. Across Europe, nearly 60,000 breaches were reported during just the first 8 months of the GDPR. We offer the following recommendations to managers. 1. Appoint a data protection manager. 2. Create a data governance committee. 3. Establish data protection management teams. 4. Implement retention policy and procedures. And 5. Create training for all employees to include how to recognize personal data and how it should be handled. As we wrap up our presentation, we hope that you take away the importance of treating personal data confidentially. Within GDPR, we recommend that businesses incorporate the following. Be sure to have internal policies and standard operating procedures, general work instructions, and business process descriptions. Additionally, make sure to have system usage instructions along with individual instruction from process owners, IT system owners, and other superiors. In the event that there is a data protection incident, there are a few steps to follow. Number 1, immediately notify data protection management of any data protection incidents as soon as you become aware of them. Number 2, document any data protection incident as detailed as possible. And 3, assist the data protection management in handling any incidents, if and as requested. Thank you for listening to our presentation. We hope you've learned a little bit more about GDPR. Have a great and wonderful semester.